I went to UC San Diego. We didn't have a journalism program. And my interest to get into journalism is mainly because I really disliked the other student newspaper on campus. There wasn't really much coverage of, we had a very large student government budget that was coming out of student fees. Wasn't much coverage of that. Wasn't much coverage of a number of racist incidents that were happening on campus in years prior and in current context. So started up a sort of blog that became a newspaper with a couple friends of mine. And as we had sort of built out the blog, high school journalism students would come into UC San Diego and say, oh, I'd like to help you build out the news section. I'd like to help you build out the photography section. And it grew to about 50 people in a year or two, and all volunteer operations. So that's sort of how I got into journalism. And from there, I had freelanced and I had interned at various outlets, eventually making my way to MinPost, where I was a Washington correspondent, and also where I worked with these two here to start The Objective without asking permission from my editor at MinPost. And The Objective itself was started in much of the same way. It was started as a series of blog posts from myself and others, and evolved into what is now a much more substantive outlet where we have a consistent newsletter that Holly runs, which is a Q&A, and I can let Holly talk more about that, as well as an off-week newsletter, as well as stories, criticism, investigative pieces, things like that. So I'll pass the mic to Janelle next.
Yeah, hi everyone. So I think similar to Gabe, I also went to a school that didn't have a journalism program. We had a journalism minor, but it wasn't like a full-fledged thing. And there wasn't a lot of support for folks who were hoping to go into journalism, after college. And so I actually joined The Objective when I was still a student at UC Davis. And so that was 2 years ago. And that essentially happened because Gabe was tweeting about, Gabe had tweeted about, Black journalists getting essentially erased on social media and the sort of double standard that happened in newsrooms when it came to objectivity and, standing up for human rights. And so he had put out a call, for anyone who was interested in working with him on things like that. And, me engaging with that call led to me getting involved with The Objective at large. But I think part of the reason that I was really interested in that piece and also in The Objective's mission at large is because I was actually a science and tech studies major when I was at UC Davis, with a focus in data and media technologies. And one of the first pieces that I read when I was in that program was Donna Haraway's Situated Knowledges. And that talked a lot about, this idea of objectivity as like an illusion. And if you've listened to Lewis Raven Wallace's podcast, The View from Nowhere, he talks similarly about objectivity. And so I was approaching journalism from sort of this kind of outsider standpoint, even though I had done student journalism at Davis, even though I had done other sort of journalism ventures at the alumni publication there. And then later on at Cal Matters, I guess I was coming into journalism with this hodgepodge of ideas that were maybe sort of outside the mainstream of what people tended to consider journalism. And so I think Gabe and I really hit it off because the idea of the publication, the stories that he wanted to tell, the media criticism specifically, and the lens that it was coming from, which was, the idea that media criticism is very white and it's hard to critique an industry that is, very white when its critics are the ones who are still benefiting from that same sort of structure that's in place. So yeah, that's essentially how that all came about. And now I work with Gabe on editing stories, soliciting pitches and things like that. And so I can talk a little bit more about some of the specific stories I've edited, maybe if that's helpful. And for my day job, I actually work for the Sacramento NPR affiliate, Cap Radio. as the Northern California reporter. So that's what I do, and I'll pass it on to Holly.
Hey everyone, and I'll just start by apologizing. I'm a little under the weather, so if I like have to sneeze or anything, just please forgive me. But yeah, my background in journalism, I did go to school I got like a radio, television, digital media degree from Southern Illinois University. And so some of my first jobs in journalism were working for television stations. So I worked both for a local PBS affiliate and a local ABC affiliate. And I was a producer and a news director at those places. So did a lot of the writing of the scripts, a lot of web producing, and it was both of us were really small stations, so it's kind of an all hands on deck thing. And in 2019, I just was kind of fed up with a lot of the ways that television news handled news. And I know it's not unique to journalism, but it was particularly, frustrated at that time and looking for something else to do. So I joined the Pulitzer Center, which is where I've been since 2019. It's a nonprofit. I'm not a journalist there, I wouldn't say. I'm a program manager. But, and though, nonprofits have their own issues, as I'm sure you're well aware, it's been good to learn, kind of a different skill set. But I actually became involved with the Objective because Marley Baldridge, another one of the co-founders, I had met her while I was doing a work visit at the University of Missouri, and we both kind of bonded over our frustration with the news portrayal of rural communities, how, low-income people, including myself, were portrayed or just left out of narratives completely, how disabled people were treated in news. So then about a year later, Marley reached out to me on Twitter and was like, hey, Gabe and I are starting this thing. We need people to do writing, and you write, right? So I was a little rusty. I still feel a little rusty sometimes, but it's really great to be able to like continue working on something that is like more directly journalism related.
So you're all not much older than the students who are in college now. You're basically all in the same generation, I would say, and many similar concerns. And I think it's really interesting that all of you are kind of working, you have day jobs, you have other jobs, or you're piecing together a number of freelance things, I think, perhaps in Gabe's case, or you've done that at times, I think, Gabe, and you're doing this as kind of an extra volunteer piece out of a feeling that this is really something that journalism needs to address. So you're at the very beginnings of your journalism careers, and you're kind of taking on a lot of touchy subjects. So that's pretty exciting, I think. I know every time I go onto your website for the Objective, I encounter a new perspective that is really engaging. So and I invite everybody to put questions in the chat or raise your hand or whatever if you want to address a point or raise a question. But I'll ask a few more questions going on. How has the Objective evolved since you all kind of found each other on Twitter and began putting this together?
Yeah, I can speak on that a little bit. And I think, each of us has a different perspective on the sort of evolution of the pieces here. The Objective started very much as a blog. It started out on Medium, which was just a couple of pieces that I was writing. And, it's grown into a place where Holly is running a newsletter every week, right? Which is not something that we were initially doing. It's grown into a place where, we're publishing long form investigative pieces like the Texas Observer piece that Janelle just edited not that long ago. And so, it's very different from what it was initially, which was just me and a couple other folks being very upset and putting out pieces on Medium. So I'll let Holly and Janelle talk a bit about those components or whatever else you want to talk about in terms of evolution.
No, I can step in and then I'll hand it to you. I think that Gabe, you kind of touched on this, but like consistency and community are maybe the two things I would say have changed a lot. Consistency, just, you know, we now are very like regular with the Q&As, especially having those on like the off weeks of our normal newsletter. And, you know, I work with a regular editor now for the newsletter who's courtesy, really incredible journalist also. And so, yeah, I think like our, you know, structure is more organized, and it's been really helpful, especially in terms of like getting funding and partners and things like that. And then community, just also kind of related. I think that, you know, we did start very small, and like I didn't really know anyone except Marley. And I think a lot of us, I don't know, I think a lot of us are connected to Gabe, but like maybe we didn't know each other. And so it's just been really cool, personally, to just see everyone get a lot closer that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I definitely feel that way too, in that it's been nice to find community with a lot of different journalists in different places in their careers. And I guess people who are adjacent to journalism as well, people who just in general care about what news is and who makes it, I think in general, because that's sort of the extent of our Slack. I think, to speak to Holly and Gabe's point about organization, when we first started, our initial title was the Objective Collective, and we were operating on a very decentralized model. And while we still, I think, do have a very, a relatively like democratic, decentralized style of organization, I think that we've ended up shaking out a more set cluster of people who are on the admin side. So me, Holly, Gabe, Marley, Curtis, and then Chelsea Ceruzo, who's also another great journalist. And so I think that's one of the big things that has changed, is just having that organization and having that be more helpful in terms of preparing us for consistency. I think another thing that has changed as we've grown is that we've been more thoughtful when it comes to what kinds of stories we're soliciting, what kinds of stories, I guess, define the Objective's mission / quote unquote brand, and making sure that we, as a collective or as an administrative collective, are aware of, you know, what sort of values the Objective is trying to, what values the pieces the Objective selects to publish or to edit, are rooted in. Because I think that, you know, initially we started more with a vague, with more of a vague sense of, you know, there are a lot of things wrong in media, and this publication exists to address those things that are wrong, and to also show like there are organizations that are doing things that are better. But I think that we've developed more specificity when it comes to soliciting those sorts of pitches. Like I think the redesign of our website when we migrated from Substack to WordPress, I think reflects that, because now we have more set categories of things that we are that we sort of arrange our articles into. And I think, you know, that was also another big change, is switching from not just Medium to Substack, but from Substack to WordPress, which was a decision we made, you know, based on Substack's principles and the way that they were handling their sort of approach to business, which Gabe can talk more about. But it was a discussion that, you know, we had, and that was, and it was also a decision that we made that was in line with our values. And so I think, like, to cap it off, I think one thing that the Objective has done as it's evolved or tried to, is to make sure that the way that we run our organization is also compliant with the sort of pieces and the sort of values that we try to promote, or I guess to share in the things that we publish. Like we ended up taking a break for a couple months, I think last year, kind of as, you know, because we really needed it, in part because like was mentioned before, we're an all volunteer organization, but also because, you know, I think it's important to model that a really breakneck, I guess, even though we weren't necessarily breakneck or daily news, like that sort of pace isn't necessarily sustainable for workers. And so that was a choice that we made too, that was, I think, aligned with, you know, sort of what we as a collective believe the industry should look like. So yeah, I think that's another thing that we've done as we've evolved, is try and evaluate our decisions from also a business side, and make sure that we are, in alignment with the things that we do editorially.
I know you did a big fundraising drive last year, and the result of that was that you're now able to pay contributors, which is great. But you guys are still all volunteer. You're not taking any salary, or when you write something, do you pay yourselves as contributors?
Not so far, but the plan is in the immediate future to start paying people. I will likely be paid last because I want to make sure everyone else is paid first. But first and foremost, the two people that we want to make sure are paid are Janelle and Holly, actually, just because of the consistency and amount of time that they're spending on the editorial side. That's also meant that the bulk of my job has become revenue, which is not something I particularly love, but it is something that I think is critical. And so that's looked like, we had a successful fundraising campaign, but that can only take us so far in terms of just paying contributors and keeping our website running, paying for media liability insurance, which is a cost that's, I think it was around $2,400 for the year, something like that. And so we've also been looking to grant money. We got a grant from IndieGraph, which is a Canadian journalism entrepreneurship collective, and they just gave us $25,000. Which is, that's quite a large grant for us. But I think, as we're looking to build salaries, ends up just being a drop in the bucket, right? So it's a sort of consistency that's needed to grow revenue to the point where we can pay folks part-time and then full-time and then go from there, while also continuing to pay our contributors fairly and ideally increasing the contributor rates that we can pay. I think we're already quite competitive with Poynter and Neiman Lab and Columbia Journalism Review, but I'd like to be more than competitive, because I think folks that are freelancing deserve better.
Yeah, maybe we'll come back around to talking about freelancing, because I think a lot of our students are interested in knowing more about the freelance life. But I wonder, and congratulations, by the way, on your grant. That's a pretty significant chunk of money, as you say. It goes quickly, but still, that's a big step up. I wonder if Gabe, you might share your screen, and maybe the three of you could walk us through some of the content on the site and talk about why you have the verticals that you do, or why you, how some of the stories came about. Just give us the kind of a quick tour.
Sure. So can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great. So we transitioned from what were we on before? The terrible website that Janelle was talking about prior, Substack, to WordPress. I think not that long. How long has it been now? Do either of you know at this point?
I think we transitioned probably October last year, because I remember when we came back from our break, we had switched to a new website.
That makes sense. So the Substack was pretty limited in terms of ways we could categorize and ways we could display the kinds of stories we're publishing. And since then, we've moved into a place, like we mentioned, where we have a Q&A and we have a newsletter. So there is basically a newsletter, some form of newsletter happening every week. Beyond that, there's a subscribe portion, and then there's categories for the stories. And so, we have stories centered around language. So, the ways in which words or specific language are used in journalism, and that could be around gender, it could be around ableism, it could be around Palestine, just ways in which language has been used or codified, often ways that it's assumed to be objective and sort of status quo journalism that, we can find ways to critique or break down or talk about, why something isn't necessarily objective in the way that objectivity is often held up to be. It could be missing coverage. It could just be, pieces that we think aren't being written about elsewhere. And so we're not writing those pieces, but we're writing about what that looks like why aren't those pieces being written about? Which, it could be about the digital divide in journalism, or it could be about how media criticism itself is a very white space. Wasn't much coverage of that in general. And then media workers, we tend to focus on, what does it look like for newsroom staffers to have protections in the newsroom? So that could be, journalism unions. It could be discrimination in the newsroom. It could be how student journalists are impacted by, policies where they're not paid in their student newsroom. What does that look like? Then we have provocations, which is not my favorite category. It's sort of a catch-all for everything else, if I'm honest, which is just basically opinions and stories about everything else, which can be looking for a better way to categorize the rest of our pieces. If you have ideas, happy to take them anytime. So that's pretty much our website. I mean, we have a donation and a subscribe portion as well. We have an about us, we have a how to pitch us. And then we also list out all of our supporters on the Our Supporters page, which we're going to add our new grant to pretty soon.
Great. I was reading about your involvement with this recent letter to the Pulitzer Committee. Want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Holly, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. So are you talking about the Q&A with John?
I think that's where I read it. Yeah.
Yeah. So we kind of, in our last regular issue, Gabe wrote a really great lead about, with the kind of touched on this, but without really getting into it because the timing didn't really work out. And so the way our Q&As work is we really just like to talk to people who we think are like doing good things in journalism, or, setting good standards, or, maybe they're founding an organization that we think is really cool and we want to highlight them as well. And so the timing kind of worked out that this week, or I guess this past Friday, this letter that you mentioned came out, which was addressed to the Pulitzer Prizes, largely urging them to include a survey as a requirement to be eligible to win a prize. And so a few people organized this, mainly Cece Way, who we had another Q&A with, and John, who we interviewed this time. And so John is also the president of News Guild. And so we spoke with him about how the letter came about. And I thought this was like particularly interesting because it reminded me a little bit about one of our first big stories or involvements, which was the response to the Harper's letter. And so it's very interesting to see, thanks Gabe, how, this collective action is still working. And yeah, it was a great thing to be a part of, because we also did sign the letter to the Pulitzer Prizes. And, I think the hope that we have, and also the other signatories have, is that by more organizations participating in these surveys by the News Leaders Association and other organizations, we know more about the demographics of newsrooms, and then have, a good starting point that we can improve upon. And yeah, here's the letter. I don't know, Gabe, do we want to talk about this, or you go for it? You started this, so
yeah, this was a sort of, it wasn't initially intended to be on the objective, but essentially myself and a number of other people in the Journalists of Color Slack group were discussing the Harper's letter, which, if you're not familiar with, was a letter from a lot of prominent signatories like J.K. Rowling, sort of saying that, free speech was under attack and implying that cancel culture was to blame. And we were talking about it because we were bothered in that the letter didn't really offer any specifics. And it also seemed to ignore the ways in which people of color had been left out of conversations for a long time. Or basically any group that has been, marginalized in the history of publishing or journalism has been left out. And so our frustrations turned into this letter, which is, challenging that letter, a more specific letter on justice and open debate, where we responded to all of the points in the letter. And I believe our letter ended up having, several hundred signatories, journalists from, Vice, from my old coworkers at MinPost, folks from academia. And so that was the sort of end result. HuffPost, The Hill, things like that. Yep.
I wanted to go back to the Pulitzer letter, just to provide a little background for some of the students who might not have been following the story, which is that for years, it's now called the News Leaders Association. I can't remember all the different names this group has had. I think it was the Managing Editors Association at the beginning or something like that. Howie, you may remember better than I. Anyway, this group has been around for a long time, and it's one of the things that it's done is try to survey newsrooms to get a sense of how diverse newsroom staffs are. response rates have never been great, but in recent years, they've been atrocious. And it's been kind of a badge of shame for journalism that newsrooms have just not bothered to respond and be transparent about who's reporting the news in their newsrooms. And so yes, ASNI, American Society of Newspaper Editors, right? Thank you. So this move was an attempt to try to leverage the Pulitzer Prizes as a place to say, well, you can't win a Pulitzer Prize unless you participate in the News Leaders Association survey or a similar survey run by a legitimate group, just not self-publishing your own survey, which is what, for example, the New York Times does, allowing it to present the data however they want to present it. So that's what that's about. So I'd really love to open up the chat to any questions, or raise your hand or whatever. In the meantime, maybe we could talk a little bit about freelancing. If anybody has any questions about the freelance life, or how to put together a living as a freelancer, plus have health benefits. Gabe, you want to take that one on?
Yeah, I mean, it's I work for Grist now full time, but I have freelanced in the past. I don't have great suggestions. I find that journalism is extremely precarious. To be honest, I relied on my partner's healthcare while I was freelancing, and that was a great benefit to me. But I think without that, it can be pretty difficult. I know that one of our other team members, Chelsea, teaches a journalism class in DC specifically on freelancing, and talks a lot about this and the sort of precarity of healthcare. Freelancing can also be, and I let me know if I'm rattling off too many critiques of freelancing, but freelancing can also be difficult in that, you write the piece and ostensibly someone will pay you, but you might have to track down that payment for months or even years, or you may never be paid at all, depending on the relationship with the editor. So I think those are some of the things that I think about quite often. I also think that there's a strange language to freelancing in itself when you're making that initial pitch to editors via email that I don't know is taught, probably because it's sort of informal, but it's odd to me that there's a sort of language that a lot of editors respond to in a specific format of pitches that I'm happy to talk about. I don't know if Holly or Janelle, you have anything else to say about
that. Pablo, you had a question or comment?
Yeah, but I don't know if they want to pass on the baton of that answer to someone else before I ask the question.
Janelle, Holly?
Go for it.
Hi, guys. Great effort. I wish I had known the objective a little bit earlier. We use one of the first debates in class that we had, and I don't know, my class is called Global Journalism. So the idea is to decolonize journalism to a certain degree, which is very hard. But anyway, and I see a few faces here that have taken this class this semester with us. We talked about the Harper's letter that was violently rebuked by Matt Taibbi, et cetera, and so on and so forth. And one of the conclusions that we came up with in class is that there's also a cross section between elitism and freedom of speech, right? Like when people are concerned about the speech that is harmful on Twitter, they're and restricting the or Twitter or any other platform. They're also concerned about like the in general, the small person's freedom of speech, right? So there's a transsectionality here between class and race that few respondents to that letter have discussed. We came up with the idea that probably a better way to protect your newsroom from cancel culture was to unionize them, or actually give them not an at-will contract that would protect them from being fired on the spot, right? And voluntarily have not read the letter that you came up with, but is there anything that on that area that you're working on, like cross sections between class, race, ethnicity, but also nationality, et cetera, and how important it is to actually be aware that journalism is situated and class situated, but also race situated and nationality situated?
Yeah, I think that's actually much of the way we describe our coverage, is at the intersections of various, including, gender as well, the sexuality. And so I think, one thing we often talk about unions and at least for me, I come to the same conclusion, but I was looking recently at our last newsletter. I had written a bit about how the Washington Post, for example, doesn't provide its union with like race and ethnicity data that they can actually use. And so they have to just pull from what the Post is saying and just sort of take it at face value. But they just did, I don't know if you saw that study that the union put together on the lack of parity in pay in the newsroom across race and gender, and also the report that came along with it from the Black Caucus in the union, which I don't think would have been published without having that union support, right? Because if you feel like you're going to be fired for publishing opinions like that, then you're probably not going to publish them. So yeah, to answer your question, I think yes. Janelle or Holly, I don't know if you have any other specific answers.
Holly, I'd like to go back to something you said earlier when you talked about meeting Marley, and you talked about being from a rural community and being from I don't remember exactly how you characterized it, but from low wage or working family, and how that perspective is often not part of the newsroom, especially at the more elite newsrooms. And I think that's a particular interest to a lot of our students. We're a state university. A lot of our students are, very few of our students are from fancy elite backgrounds. So I think that would be an interesting perspective to bring into this conversation.
Yeah, and I think Janelle and Gabe can talk about this a little bit too, but yeah, I guess just like I grew up in a town of 280 people. And, my mom is a construction worker, and my parents are separated, and I have 4 siblings. If I wasn't going to get a scholarship, I wasn't going to go to college. And I didn't even really do journalism. I did a television and radio degree because it was more of a trade degree than was journalism. And even then, I think there was a lot of maybe not animosity, but like there was definitely a certain attitude of like, well, it's different than journalism. And unfortunately, I will say that like there has been some kind of weird learning curves and things I live in DC now, which is very different than Illinois. And so there has definitely been like, learning a lot of things that I don't know about, like business and how like offices work. And when I was in a newsroom, also how like newsrooms work, that I'm realizing that you don't really learn about if you don't have like parents who worked in an office, or you didn't really learn about that in school if you were able to go to school. But I think that like what's been really helpful for me is things are changing a little bit, where like some of the people that I work with also had similar upbringings, and we can talk about like, hey, how do you negotiate a salary, and why do we have to go to happy hours? Like, what is this weird dance of participating in this work culture? And I think that sometimes it's been hard for people to believe that your background is like worthy to like do the work you're doing. But I guess just a little bit of hope would be that there are people who are getting frustrated with the way that news is, and they want to read things that are accessible to them, and so your voice is important in that way. And you don't need to go, get a graduate degree in journalism and have a parent who's on the board of the New York Times or something like that to have a column. And, I think that even those people have imposter syndrome too. So just keep doing what you're doing.
Thanks, Holly. That's really great. Would love to hear some questions from students on any topic. Sarah?
Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm one of the members of BBSOCJ. I'm actually graduating this May, and I'm kind of entering the real world of journalism. And the more I get into it, the more I realize from like several experiences I've had so far professionally, the term, it's something I'm very passionate about covering, is climate justice. And that term is not something that people like to hear. And it's something that they feel in journalism, at least, they think it has a bias and a bias in it. And I just think that's so strange that like acknowledging inequity and like, recognizing it and writing about it. I think that's like a strange thing to think that's bias, but maybe that's just me. I might be wrong there. But I wonder if you guys have had any discussions about that or talked about that at all in the objective or climate justice issues in general. It's okay if you don't have like all of the knowledge of everything you've ever published, because I know you guys publish a lot.
I'm trying to think if we have, I can say that my full-time job is working at GRIST, right, where the tagline is climate justice solutions. So we definitely talk about climate justice. But I'm trying to think if we've done that in the objective, possibly at some point, but not recently, I don't think. Oh, actually, yeah, we did. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think we've done some, like at the very least, talked about like the Uproot project. I don't know if that's what you were going to mention, Gabe, but yeah, I think that is one area where we are still, I guess, like figuring out how to approach, or not figuring out how to approach, but still diversifying our coverage, if that makes sense.
What is the project that you just referenced?
Oh, let me find the link. It's a group of environmental journalists. It actually is kind of housed at GRIST, so Gabe might be okay. Gabe found the link faster, but yeah, it's for journalists of color and students, sort of journalists who have been in marginalized positions in the industry who are seeking to cover environmental justice and climate justice issues.
Cool. Well, there's a pitch waiting for you to write it there, Sarah. Amber.
Hi, my name is Amber. I'm a junior. I'm a member of the Building a Better School of Communications and Journalism workshop. And my question is, I guess on the more like financial side of things, I don't like applying for internships or doing things without getting paid, because I find that like I just feel like I deserve, and everyone deserves, to get paid for their hard work. And so a lot of the internships and jobs that I have been looking at for this summer are not paid. And that really deters me from wanting to get them. So I guess my question would be, since you guys are kind of low on funds in terms of who you can pay and who makes money, and a lot of you are doing all of this work on like a volunteer basis, and I just wanted to know like what motivates you to do such hard work and like exhausting work with no financial reward, because I am looking for that type of motivation in my like future, career pursuits.
I mean, sorry. I guess I would say, first of all, that I think your impulse is right to not want to do work that isn't compensated fairly, and I think that that's valid and really strong, I guess, thing to keep in mind, because I think you're right that nobody should be doing work on that isn't compensated for what it is. And I hope that, you are able to get an internship that does pay you, or at the very least find some kind of like scholarship that finances whatever internship you might be doing. I guess when it comes to like doing this specific work unpaid, I think for me, I know that a lot of journalists talk about how journalism isn't advocacy, right? And I think that's just something really common, because there are different roles, right, for people when it comes to talking about advancing human rights, et cetera, et cetera. But I do think that, at least for me, I think about like a lot of my friends, I guess, this is another element to my perspective on journalism. A lot of my friends are organizers, and a lot of my friends are, involved in grassroots efforts for, again, like, not outside of their day jobs or outside of their main work. And I think that this is like, I think for me, journalism is kind of the way that I best know how to contribute to sort of efforts to, I guess, imagine a better world, for lack of a better phrase. And I think that to me is something that kind of grounds me in, like, I would want to keep doing this work for a long time, or at least, find a way to keep doing it. Because I think for me, journalism kind of boils down to, obviously having a stake in how history or current events are portrayed and are told. And so language is a component of that, as well as framing. But also, I guess, like with my day job, I think about journalism as a tool to get material resources to people who might need them. And so, I think that this work kind of bridges that, where it's not material resources, but it is, talking about language and talking about things that, might seem relatively inconsequential in the grander scheme of things, but do matter when it comes to, what kinds of history is going to be referenced in the future, what kinds of sources are going to be looked at. And I think that to me is really important, and is a big reason of like behind why I want to keep doing this work. I think that, it is, I think a lot about how risky it is. I think when I signed the Harper's letter, and not as part of the objective, but I was an intern for Cal Matters at the time. And I was so worried about getting fired. Like, I had a nightmare about it. And I like went back and forth about like, should I sign this? Is everything going to be fine? Everything was fine. I didn't get fired. And I mean, I guess all this to say is that I think that it's hard and it's risky sometimes to be outspoken about, just being willing to envision that, even the bare minimum, right? That there is a journalism where expressing your emotions towards events that affect like your bodily autonomy, for example, could be viewed as you not being a good reporter, you not wanting to tell the truth, so to speak. But at the same time, I think that, Gabe said something to me when we were first talking about things for the objective, and I bring it up a lot because it is something I return to, where he said, there are people who are building a better media, who believe in a better like media and a better world, and then you just have to find them. And I think that sticks with me, because I think one of the big sticking points about the objective is that it is part of a broader coalition of people who do believe in something better. And so I guess, yeah, I don't know. That was a really long-winded answer, but Holly, Gabe, if you want to pick up the baton.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts. One, first and foremost, definitely make sure you have enough money to like eat and live, right? That's critical. I think beyond that, one thing that I often think about is there's a significant difference between doing the thing you really want to do, right, for yourself, and like working with other people that you want to work with, versus working for like a large institution with lots of money that doesn't want to pay you fairly. It's like we pay decently competitively for our contribution rates, and we aim to like pay ourselves fairly, but we're doing that on a shoestring budget. Whereas I know a lot of outlets are out there with millions and millions of dollars in funding and pay interns poorly. And I know that because I interned for some of them, and they have millions and millions of dollars, and they paid me, in one instance, $300 every 2 weeks, which is not enough money to buy groceries or sustain rent, So I completely get the compulsion to not work for places like that. And if you don't want to, definitely don't. I think they can be useful in finding ways to justify like the next step in your career. And I think if that's the use you're getting out of it, I think that can be useful. But beyond that, I definitely agree that it's not super useful. If you don't feel like it's a fulfilling place and you don't feel like the work you're doing is going to help you get to that place that is fulfilling, that it's probably not useful to you. So hopefully that's somewhat helpful. But I definitely think like if you're not finding those opportunities, then just do the kind of reporting you want to do without those people. Like write it, ask your friends to edit it, put it on Medium, and if you have like solid editing and maybe a couple nice photos, then maybe it represents your work and maybe it's a solid clip.
Yeah, I think just like adding on to what Gabe said, journalism doesn't have to be your entire identity. And that's something I still think I'm trying to learn. I'm not very good at like setting boundaries in that way sometimes, but if you can get a full-time job that's like not related, working at a library or I don't know, like bartending or working construction, working in a public government office, things like that, and then you're able to write on the side and not be like really running yourself ragged while doing it. I think that's okay. I think that that's another thing that's changing too, is like, I don't know, one thing that some people told me was like, well, never take a job in PR or in government because you'll never be able to return to journalism. And maybe, I don't know, but like I also think that like in general that kind of ideology is shifting a little bit, and it's okay to like take care of yourself or take care of other people, and you're more likely to continue caring about the work that you're doing if you don't burn yourself out that way. So yeah, I don't know if that helps at all, but yeah, get paid. Don't take an unpaid internship.
Yeah, I guess just to add on to that too, like I know a lot of people are like drawn to journalism from a value standpoint, but it doesn't make you like a worse person or somebody who doesn't have like convictions or anything like that if you choose to take a PR job or choose to take any better paid job over a journalism job. Because like Holly said, at the end of the day, like you need, and Gabe said, at the end of the day you need to like eat, you need to be able to take care of yourself and whatever basic needs you might have, in order for you to do the work that like matters to you.
I agree too, that I think that the absolute ban on going from PR communications back into journalism, I don't think that's as I think it's more porous now than it was 30, 40 years ago. It's my sense. Don't ask me for any data because I don't have it, but just from what I've observed, I think that there's a more flexibility now than there used to be. Other questions from students? Maya, you always have questions.
Hello, thank you guys for coming to speak to us. So I remember when I was looking at the objective, I did see, what was it called? It was called solidarity reporting. What's the difference between solidarity reporting, and then I saw you guys also audience empathy, like the difference between the solidarity and empathy, and maybe why one over the other, or if it's a little mix of both. What should journalists strive for?
I think Anita Varma, who's a professor and on our advisory board, who coined the term solidarity journalism, would be better able to speak to this. But I think that from listening to Anita's work, just having empathy is sort of broader than solidarity journalism, which is like almost an academic concept that she's defined. And the way that I've understood solidarity journalism and the way that she's defined it is like having solidarity with people on the ground that are most impacted by an event. So the example that she's talked about when I've gone to her workshops is, the insurrection in DC was obviously covered by a lot of news media, but there wasn't a ton of coverage on what did this look like for people on the ground, sitting on their porch or like sitting at a restaurant that were just disturbed and had their day threatened by law enforcement that were sort of around, or just protesters that were committing acts of violence. And so I think that's the sort of specificity of solidarity journalism. Whereas empathy, I think, it can be broader. It isn't as well defined, but it's still important, right?
Yeah, I think to expand on, I guess, like the broadness of empathy, I think part of that is kind of coming at interviews, especially when it comes to speaking with folks who come from backgrounds that have been, I guess, not treated well by media, is part of that is like trauma-informed interviewing and stuff like that, or just being mindful of the fact that, there is a difference of when you're interviewing like a government official who is a seasoned interview and knows how to interact with reporters versus, somebody who has just been rattled by an event or, is very affected by something going on, and who maybe this is their first contact with a reporter and may not necessarily be fully aware of the distinction between on background or, on the record and stuff like that. And, I think part of audience empathy and broader solidarity reporting is just, being mindful of that, and then being willing to adjust, I guess, being willing to adjust your approach accordingly. So, giving someone breaks, or maybe explaining more about like what those terms mean and things like that. Just because, I think part of empathy is being able to see it from the other side of like, I just went through this huge event and this person that I don't know is going to talk to me. I have no idea what they're going to do with my story or whatever I tell them. And that's a really precarious situation to be in. And I feel like, like a big part of audience empathy, or being able to, I guess, execute solidarity reporting in the way that Anita talks about it, I think that's a big component of it.
I'm just looking. University of Wisconsin has a great guide to what they call less extractive reporting, which has a lot of really interesting ideas along the vein of what you're just talking about, Janelle. And another thing that your comments made me think of was I wrote a piece for Pointer in the last couple of years about reporters who cover homelessness. And one of the phrases that really stuck with me from that reporting was the idea of with us, not about us, because all too often stories about people who are suffering in some way, the people who are actually suffering compared to the number of experts and professors and analysis and blah, 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 those voices don't get as much attention as they probably should in a lot of reporting. So I think that's kind of in the line of what you're talking about, I guess, with empathetic journalism, right? Well, we just have a couple more minutes left. We could probably have time for one or two more questions. So, Nikki, any thoughts? I know this you've been with the workshop since inception, and so this is as a senior, your last hurrah. So I'm going to ask you to take us out with a final question. Oh, you're muted.
I think a good way to end this then is, if any journalist knows how to end a good interview, is, well, was there anything left unsaid? Is there anything that you guys wanted to say that we didn't ask?
We've taught you well.
I think one thing that I meant to say in response to Pavlo, what you brought up about like the intersections of free speech and social structures, particularly like the isms, I think one thing that I think about a lot, because so I'm Filipino. My dad grew up during the Marcos administration in the 70s. And, as some of you might know, Ferdinand Marcos was a dictator, a fascist dictator in the Philippines, and one of his descendants is running for president in the Philippines right now. And so I think a lot about how, many of my friends who are involved in organizing in the Philippines, or even just journalists in the Philippines, have been red tagged or, persecuted by the government, labeled as communist, even if they aren't, which, there's a whole broader spectrum of things to get into there, but have been persecuted for the government simply because they are reporting the facts of the current Duterte administration, or trying to tell the truth about the atrocities that have happened under the Marcos administration. And I think a lot about how in the United States there is a lot of hullabaloo, there's a lot of discussion about cancel culture, when a lot of the times the consequences people face for saying something that ruffles people's feathers, that very likely will not lead to death. Whereas, in the Philippines, a lot of times that will. And I guess that's something that I think about a lot when it comes to, discussions about free speech and it being quote unquote under attack in America. So I just wanted to, I guess, throw that in there as well. But what you mentioned when you talked about the Harper's letter made me think of that, and sort of the I guess distinctions that we maybe lose if we look at free speech only from, I guess, like an American standpoint, or only look at, you know, don't look at journalism through an internationalist lens.
Yeah, that's a super great point, because like again, like I grew up during a very violent dictatorship in Argentina, and people whose like parents or friends disappeared, and I have friends who are sons of disappeared. So yeah, I mean the toll that takes on any type of journalist, and I grew up as a journalist there, and then I came here, is substantially different. And but also, yeah, you're right in terms of how we see foreign coverage too, right? Like how we see the invisibilization of a certain group of voices that are not heard in the watermark of the State Department, and every conversation that appears in the media is foreign correspondence and foreign coverage. So yeah, I think that I mean, I don't know, we're in our small spaces, we're trying to like show our students that that aspect of that is not super great of American journalism. But yeah, for the most part, I think that yeah, there's few efforts. I mean, FAIR, you, maybe some other people who are trying to shed light on those things, but it's not very well. It's not a very popular view, I guess, at this point.
Well, thank you all so much for being here, both as listeners and as speakers and as questioners. I think that it's just a really healthy development that young journalists are interrogating some of the premises on which journalism is being conducted and raising issues that bear thinking about. So thank you all very much for all that you do. And thanks, everyone.
For inviting.
Bye.
Oh, and pitch us if you want to pitch us, I should mention.
There you go.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, everyone.